So let's go to the releases, okay? Because the most recent, there was two laws passed. One, there was a chunk of everything should have been released in 2017, and
Right.
Trump doesn't do it, right? What did he hold off on releasing the first time?
So the JFK Records Act passed after the movie in 92 had a 25-year sunset provision, which is this JFK independent board obtained records from government agencies, put them in the National Archives. But the agencies were given the right to withhold certain material on grounds of national security or privacy. They could say, don't publish this name until he dies. He doesn't want it in public.
Yeah.
Well, that was legitimate, concern. But the law was after 25 years, everything would be made public regardless. Well, when 25 years rolled around in October 2017, it came to Trump. Mike Pompeo and Chris Wray went to Trump, and there's a Reuters story about this, and said, we can't release this stuff. At least there's a lot of stuff that we don't want to release. And at that point, there were redactions in about 16,000 documents. In a collection, for perspective, there's about 319,000 different records in the JFK collection. Okay,
right.
So 16,000. It's not insignificant number. It's a couple percentage points. And among those, we could tell, that there was very interesting, material. So when the agency and when Pompeo said, "Look, you can't release it," Trump said, "Fine," and they released some stuff, but basically Trump kicked the can down the road. And he
punted it was it 5 years? He punted it. What was the punt?
No, exactly 4. So he said, "We'll revisit this in October 2021."
Well, then that's Joe Biden this time.
That's Joe Biden. So Joe Biden, that's right at the end of the pandemic. So Biden says, "Look, we had a pandemic. CIA can't do this. We're going to wait. We're going to give them another year."
Okay. So another punt.
Yeah. When the Washington Post called me up and said, "What do you think?" I said, "This is like the COVID dog ate my homework." It's like, this is the lamest excuse. You've had 29 years and you're going to blame it on COVID, So then a year later, Biden did the same thing Trump did. He released a bunch of stuff and he held a bunch of stuff. And so that brought.
But he also signed an executive order that seemed to try to no more or something, right? Explain that part of it.
Yeah. So what Biden did was he held back a bunch of stuff. He released a bunch of stuff, but he didn't want this question to come back to him. And so he issues an order in June of 2023. And he says, "Look, from now on, the release of this material is up to the NSA, the CIA, or DOD, whatever agency holds that. And they have this plan for release." And they were called, in typically deceptive way, transparency plans. And the transparency plans were designed to make sure that there was no transparency. And so those went into effect. And so that was actually sort of a step back, because it sort of eviscerated the JFK Records Act by putting the control of the disposition of the documents back in the hands of the agency. The whole reason that the law worked and was very effective was the final decision about a CIA document was not made by a CIA official. It was made by an outside person who could balance national security and public interest.
It's a board, right? It's a board that oversees this. Who is it?
Yeah, so that board. It was the Assassination Records Review Board. There's no structure now. So that was the step backwards. And Biden's order was he basically gave control of the last of the documents back to the agencies.
Right.
Well, so along comes Trump. Okay. Now Trump had caved the first time.
Right.
He took a lot of grief from his friends, and Tucker Carlson and Andrew Napolitano in particular.
Right.
Really chastised him. And when you listen to the interviews, Trump's very uncomfortable. He's not his usual blustering self. He's like, he doesn't want to talk about it. He's embarrassed.
But they showed him something. There's no doubt in my mind. Trump, you've got to make him change his mind. You've got to show him a fear of something. So that's what, what is it that Pompeo showed him? But anyway, go ahead.
But Trump said at one point, "If you'd seen what I'd seen, you wouldn't have."
Yeah.
I think that's just so much blarney, like there's no reason. I mean, if he knew something substantive, why wouldn't he say it? I don't believe that he knows anything substantive. And I don't
he
really.
usually blurts it out anyway, right? Like the
Yeah,
guy's a
right.
terrible, you never tell Trump a secret. He'll eventually tell everybody.
Yeah. So anyway, Trump's embarrassed. And then RFK is running. RFK made this an issue when he was running as a
Right.
Democrat and an independent. He had a petition to open up all the JFK records. And when RFK came on board with Trump at that rally last August, and that's when Trump got back on the JFK bandwagon. He said, "No, we're going to release all the JFK files." And there's this roar of the crowd. I mean, it was a great applause line for Trump. And
Sure.
I think that's when he latched back onto it. It's like, oh, this is cool. And he goes on Joe Rogan and says, I'm going to, he incorporated that into his message. And I think is trying to, regain face with his followers. So he comes to office and he writes this very expansive, welcome executive order 14176, calling for a plan to release the JFK, RFK, and MLK plan. So we saw yesterday Tulsi Gabbard is acting on the RFK and MLK.
We're taping, just to timestamp this. You said, yeah, and I'm fine. We're taping on Friday, April 11th. So in this case, on April 10th. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. So that's the RFK and MLK part, which is now seems to be moving for the first time. We haven't heard much about that since Trump's order. We've heard a lot more about JFK because the order, the National Archives released a lot of stuff on March 18th, a little too.
By the way, some of this is the same memo, same documents, just with less blacked out stuff, right?
Well, the good thing is that almost all of the redactions have come off. There are still some redactions, but the problem there may be that the original copy is redacted. I mean, it's like the original copy in the government file.
They don't know how to unredact it, is what you're saying.
It's marked out with black magic mark. I mean, maybe you could do some chemical analysis, but the more recent redactions are done with, basically with white tape. And so it's easy. You just take the tape off and so some documents can't be redacted, but most of them have. And so we see these documents in their entirety for the full first time. And like with the Schlesinger memo and the Angleton Senate testimony, these last details are important. And if you think about it, it stands to reason, right? I mean, if you want to hide something and you're being pressured to release things, well, you release the things that are least damaging or least important to you first. And the things you release last are the things that are most important to you. So what we're seeing now is what these agencies thought was the very most important thing.
So let's go back to now. One of the more interesting things that on the week on April, I think it was April 10th, that the DNI head, Tulsi Gabbard, implied in her new release of saying there's more files, is this idea that more files were found. JFK files were found. What, do you have a sense of what that could be? Do you have a theory of what was, that stuff that had never been delivered to the archives?
It's intriguing. I don't know the bodies of records in MLK and RFK the way I do JFK. So,
well, she was implying on JFK files that there was more on that.
I believe, I know that they have JFK files that have never been released. And, what the FBI, when the FBI found these records in February, I mean, that's the proper response of an agency, which is the president issued an order. They want all JFK files. Let's take another look, see what we got, put it out there. The CIA hasn't done that. I mean, if Gabbard's going to get them to do that, to go back and just do a good faith search, not saying you're hiding something, just make sure you get everything, and make it public. So that could be, very positive, and that there's somebody in the intelligence establishment saying this is a priority. There's a public interest here. We're not doing business as usual around classification. That's all very positive. So, remains to be seen how they delivered on the JFK things. I had a report card of, things that were redacted and are now, and we wanted to be released. And we pretty much have all of those. I just got a couple the other day, and I'm going to go through the checklist and see and compare think we ultimately had like 18 things.
Right.
So that's a big step forward, but that's just the records that had already been acknowledged and given to the National Archives. Right. There are these other things that were never turned over. And that's the next phase of this search. And I think that's what Gabbard's talking about.